Hi, this is Paul, and this is obviously a little different. I don't have my books behind me, and I'm not even in North America. We are in the basement of, what's this place?
The Theological University Kampen Utrecht in the Netherlands.
And Sarah has been gracious to get us this space, and we have a number of guests. Everybody here has been on the channel before, but I still want people to go around and introduce themselves and tell us why they're interested in this conversation. We're going to have a conversation about Estuary, and we even have a live studio audience today, so pretty exciting. So let's go this way, and then Sarah will sort of lead the conversation because she's been doing some study on this as part of her theological education. Job, you are well known to the channel.
So they say. Hi, ik ben Job van Achterberg. I should probably speak English. And
You can get some authenticity in there.
That is true. It does make the real me come out. So don't distract me. I've been on Paul's channel a couple of times, wrestling with various things, and I've been interested in this whole community that's been forming around Paul's YouTube videos, the Twitter sphere, and eventually the Discord that I helped set up. And I've tried setting up an Estuary group with my own church. I'm sure we'll get into that later, and I should probably give the mic to you, Aaron.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Aaron. I'm also here from the Netherlands. I am currently teaching philosophy. I've been very interested in this whole phenomenon that is taking place here, and also for me personally, as you can probably see, I'm one of the younger ones here. So for me, it's also interesting to see what is that intermediate space in between not going to church and going to church, and does that exist? So therefore, I'm interested to partake in this conversation.
Wow. That's my son. So I'm Bas, I'm his father. That's my main occupation. We've got 6 kids. In preparation of that, I did some industrial engineering, financial business consulting, and then theology. Taught New Testament here in Utrecht, and currently working at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam on the integration of economic thinking and theological thinking. So that's one part. And I'm still learning, so I'm being introduced to all kinds of people on this corner of the internet, and I'm very excited about that. And one of my questions is how will the community that looks for meaning look like in the coming years?
I'm John, and I have been a friend of Paul's for some years, and been watching the whole development of his YouTube channel and the community that evolved around it. And at the same time, I was also organizing various activities on the ground, making use of the Meetup software that's available worldwide. And Meetup is primarily to do things on the ground. And so I said to Paul, we need to do something on the ground. And Paul says, you're in charge of it, so that's why I'm here right now.
All right. Well, I'm Sarah Vollmer. So I'm a student here at the university. I'm an undergraduate in theology, and I'm currently working on my undergraduate thesis, which will be on the Estuary project. And this is also why we got together today to speak on the Estuary project. And I want to thank all of you very much, including the audience, for showing up today. And with that, I think we should move on to the first question of today, which is, what is Estuary and why is it important? Would you like to start, John?
Well, perhaps it would help to paint the biological picture first. And Estuary, as many people know, is the space between where the river comes down from the mountains and meets the ocean. And there is a place where the fresh water mixes, commingles with the salt water, and the turbulence continuously changes the lay of the land, and there's a lot of chaos there, and everything is changing. And Paul came up with the metaphor, and I thought it was quite genius, but it has to do with, so the fresh water of the church community and the wild open spaces of the non-church community. Is there a space in between there somehow where things can happen? And they may be a very chaotic space, and there may be a lot of changes there, but nevertheless, it seems like a good way to conceptualize what that relationship might be.
All right. And why is that important?
Well, this is my first trip to Europe, and we've not got out of the Netherlands yet. But even yesterday, with a tour through much of the country, we were up yesterday, and I still can't say a lot of the names of these towns properly. Appingedam. And a lovely gentleman was giving us a tour of the town, and he was telling us about how this was one of the main areas that all of these monasteries were founded, and we had this grand number of churches here, and we saw this beautiful church that started out as a small building and grew and grew and grew, and it's a magnificent old facility. And then John asks the guy, how many of these buildings are still hosting live churches today? One. And one building, and you could see elements of different Reformed and non-Reformed churches were sort of gathering together in it. And, so coming today into the city, walking through the city a little bit, it's a vibrant culture with a lot of young people, a lot of dynamism. And my question is, we face similar challenges in the United States in the Christian Reformed Church where I'm a minister, but will churches be relegated to museum status? And that's obviously a critical question that I think churches in Europe have been facing for a while. Job, his congregation has been asking him to become an elder to young people. And one of the things that I realized when I started a channel is that you can pump out video and content that people might be interested in, but it's way more interesting to actually have a conversation, to integrate, to challenge, to deal with all of these ideals in a real space with real people. We can do it online, and we do it online, but to actually have a community to work through these ideas, whether to embody them or to push against them. And what kind of space do we have for that? As a pastor of a little church, I regularly have people knocking on my door, and they need $20 to put gas in their tank, or they need food, or they need something like that. And I love helping people out in terms of their physical needs, but often I would find that once people would get over the fact that I'm a pastor, okay, maybe he's not scary, maybe he's not going to really proselytize or get me to be a member of his church and tithe to put money in his pocket, often they will begin to have questions about all sorts of things. And I think, where can people go to have those conversations? Especially when I hear people, it wasn't too long ago in Chicago, I was having a conversation with a wife of someone who came for the meetup. She came from another city. And I said, well, how's the church thing going for you? And she identifies as a Christian. She grew up as a Christian. She isn't going to church. Well, why don't you go to church? Because in the churches that I've been to, they seem questions aren't welcome. And so then my question is, where are questions welcome? And I don't think she's necessarily just looking for answers, although people like answers. She's looking for a place for a conversation about her question. And finally, and I've seen this in church community the whole time, churches aren't really just places with people with all the same answers. Churches are places with people who are committed to each other, and they're committed to values and certain goals, but they're in many ways more committed to the community than just a particular point that the pastor makes. And so I think if we're going to see churches not simply become museums, churches need to be spaces where people can bring their questions, their challenges, and find community and begin to discuss that and explore it and pursue it. And so for me, Estuary was the perfect sort of mental model of how that could happen.
Right.
So is Estuary then a church activity if you describe it like this?
I think it is something that churches should. Well, so I started my channel. People wanted to talk.
Okay.
Well, where am I going to meet these people? Coffee shops are kind of loud. Bars and restaurants, kind of awkward. I had all this space in the middle of the week. And so, well, you can come here. And I first thought, John and I talked about, John said, they're probably going to be a little nervous coming to church. It's the only space I got. So then they started coming. And Joey, who's been on the channel, I asked Joey, I said, is it okay meeting here in church? And he says, I think meeting in church is actually important because if you're meeting in a bar or some of these other places, people don't take the conversation as seriously. And he's an atheist. And so for me, I thought, if the church wants to have a presence in the conversations going on in the culture, the church is going to have to offer something. And churches actually have room, chairs, space usually available in non-Sunday hours. And they've also got a lot of people who have small group experience. And in terms of running an estuary, it's small group dynamics. So I thought churches have a lot of what it takes to actually facilitate and give space for this in the culture.
All right. Thank you.
To counterpoint, have you had any people show up, or you for that matter, who would be uncomfortable meeting in church?
Yeah. When we were in one of our Western Michigan estuaries, there was a lady who spoke out rather forcefully that her friend, who had contemplated participating in a conversation-like group, when she found out that it was to be held in a church, simply refused to come. So, and I have had communication on my meetup channel also. Is this just some kind of a gimmick to get me to come to your church? So there is a certain element of suspicion among a certain part of the population. I don't know if, there's probably pros and cons to both. So I'm not sure that the church space, for practical purposes, is perfect, nor is a non-church space for practical purposes perfect. But it kind of depends on what you got to weigh the alternatives. And I'm like Paul, if you can get a room for free, get it.
I would also add, it seems to be now this very clear, intermediate space in between not going to church and going to church. It's on its way there. It has to be if you're going to go to church, because what we have on this little corner of the internet is someone like John Verveke also facilitating conversations with those of other religions. And I'm not sure if they would be comfortable with that, but I'm not sure if that's a problem. And that's, I guess, my question to you. Is it a problem that perhaps people that come from other religions are also interested in these conversations would then feel uncomfortable meeting in church? Or is this perhaps not their space? Or in a mosque, yeah? What is your take on that? I'm curious of either of you.
I think the church, I can speak for the church, from the church's interest in this. In that, so as a small church pastor, I spent years on this little corner of Florin Road. People would need $20, helping homeless people. People would sort of say that's okay. But as a pastor I was a foreign missionary before this, who has an evangelistic heart, I would long to have fruitful conversations with people. And when I say fruitful, I don't mean just that they would join the church. Most pastors know that's a small group of people often. But satisfying, productive, sincere, where there's amount of mutual self-disclosure and vulnerability. I loved having those conversations with people, and they were extremely rare. And then suddenly I do a YouTube channel, and people are willing to have them with me electronically. But electronic conversations can be, you meet somebody online and the churn happens and they're off to another YouTube channel. When you're in a physical space, when you have a physical relationship, when you see each other face to face, well, there's more of a bond. And whether or not most of the people who have come to the meetup that we've had at church, they haven't joined the church or anything like that, but we've built relationships. And as a pastor, that's just gold. And before I did this, we did a lot of work with church planting. And I would watch church planters, before they'd even plant their church, we'd say, you need to have 1,000 conversations before you plant a church. Well, how are you going to do that? I'm going to buy people coffee. Well, you can do that, but I found this to be far more interesting. Fair. Because now I've got dozens of people who, I have a nearly unlimited number of people with whom I can have really satisfying and productive conversations. Now, that's a little unusual because I have a YouTube channel, but what I discovered also, and what I've known from church, is the real key to having a group is not whether people want to come to hear me. I was just talking to Manuel, who's sitting over there, and I've seen this every time we do sort of an estuary event. he comes and says, oh, I really hope so-and-so shows up because I want to meet them. Because getting to me is kind of hard because I've got a YouTube channel, but getting to each other, that's really where you knit the group together, and I know that from church life. If everyone's coming here to hear a nice sermon from me, that's not a church, that's an audience. But once they start knowing each other and get knit together into a community, then you're on your way.
I still think that Aaron's question is very appropriate in that, you know, in the symbolic, in the biological sphere, you can't really say that, you know, estuary can exist only on the riverside or only on the seaside. It is in between. So if you want to keep that metaphor somewhat intact, then there has to be an element of neutrality and an element of, you know, separateness from both sources. I think that relationship between the two sides needs to be further thought through. I'm not quite ready to make a commitment one way or the other, because I do believe that people in other religions, for example, or people who are interested in the dialogos that John Vervaeke talks about, I think that they too need a space. Everybody needs a space to hear themselves think. And I think there's a requirement of some kind of neutrality. And at the same time, it is also nice to know that there is a force out there that cares. So if the force has to be the church that cares, that makes it happen, then so be it. I think there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
But I like the fact that you pick up on that metaphor that there is a sense of required neutrality for all parties to feel like they belong equally.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. So to summarize, I think I've heard two main points about estuary. From you, Paul, I've heard that estuary is about relationships and being a community and getting to know people. And from you, I hear more the element of sharing thoughts and speaking up about what you think, about what you're experiencing. So those are not necessarily two separate things, but I think they are two different sides of the estuary. And I think it's interesting in that regard to ask the question, what is the purpose of estuary? Is it primarily to form a new community, or is it more focused on the dialogos aspect of it? Because I think that also influences the role of the church in estuary, if estuary would be part of a church.
I think the church has always had a committed mission for human flourishing. Churches give space for Alcoholics Anonymous groups. Churches give space for food banks. Churches give space for counseling. I think, especially in an age when increasingly people's lives are mediated by two-dimensional screens. And when I live in America, I don't know, you got Walmart here? Seems like you know. When I see McDonald's and Domino's, and I'm really concerned for you guys. I'm really concerned what we're exporting. But I see kids in Walmart or the supermarket, mom shopping, and they put a tablet in front of a 2-year-old. Mm-hmm. I think just as necessary as dealing with, let's say, an addiction like alcohol or drugs or issues of poverty, I think churches are uniquely situated to give people a place to begin to not just have conversations, but significant, meaningful conversations, and to give a space for that. And I think that's part of supporting human flourishing, which is a part of God's kingdom. Now, I obviously feel that this gets culminated into Christ, as Paul calls us to be in Christ. But all of these other efforts, dealing with addiction, dealing with poverty, that churches have for as long as they've been involved with, I see this as another part of that mission.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Do you have anything?
May I give a stab at it?
Of course.
I actually have a working definition of what an estuary is. Now, it's open for discussion, and this is not the last word on it, but it covers some of the basis of what we're trying to talk about here. In my estimation, estuary is a physical, in-person space where we welcome everyone's, now here comes a qualifier, everyone's myopic mental meanderings, but where...
M&M's.
Yeah, M&M's. But where, over time, as friendships develop and mutual trust grows, we may come to see in each other's reflections more nuanced insights, which sometimes, as by some higher power, give way to truth, sometimes even actionable truth. So I incorporate in this definition a reference to a higher power, yes, but I want to make it sufficiently accessible to people who do not necessarily ascribe to the notion of being in Christ, although I totally agree with Paul that is my life goal. But I do not want to assume that about everyone, and I want other people to feel welcome on their own terms to be part and bring their own. And I speak perhaps pejoratively about it because I think that a lot of people can do no better than to bring their own mental meanderings. You know, what did I call it again? Myopic mental meanderings. Yeah, because
say it with me.
yeah, it's because we think that what we think is the ultimate in thinking. So it's very myopic, and it's mental meanderings. It's what we think, and initially that's what we bring to the table, because that is why we show up in places. And then something clicks, something happens. That guy, he listens really well to me, and that guy, he really gets me. And that guy, he brought up something that really, that kind of connects with my life. And all of a sudden we start to become friends, and we start to trust each other. And the whole conversation changes. In fact, even other topics other than our own mental meanderings show up on the table. So in my mind, there is a process, and in my mind, it should welcome everyone, not just the church.
All right. And would you say then that the sharing of our mental meanderings should lead to a form of community building? Is that the goal of Estuary? Or is the goal the conversation, let's say?
No, I think that it would be ideal if people become friends.
All right. All right.
Sarah, can I throw something in here?
Yeah, sure.
I have a feeling we're among Protestants. And that may be a problem.
Please.
The way that you are describing Estuary as being something of a mental and a communal thing is very much what a Protestant church is. And I think we may have missed something out from the Orthodox and Catholic churches that is something of the mystery, something of the awe encounter. And if we tone it down too much, I'm afraid we're just reinventing Protestantism. And it may be with the same intellectual vigor as with which Protestantism arose in the 16th and 17th century. And it may just be an expression of our time. So, going back to when I was in university, we had this evangelical student group that wanted to proselytize, evangelize. And I was like, I've got very bad knees. I mean, I can't go knock doors. It's not my thing. So I got out of that. But I said, well, can't we do something else? Can't we say, invite people to have a great movie to watch, to have great conversations? And then at 11 o'clock say, nice, but anyone who wants to can go into the church space, which is not the neutral space, can go into the church space and worship and encounter something. And I'm afraid that if we talk too much about community, which is good, and intellectuality, which is also good, which I love, we may miss something that is essential, that we have to start talking about the mystical side of it, and I think that is touching some of the conversation in this corner of the internet, because people are saying, well, yes, we get it. There is something bigger than what we are, and something bigger than what we can describe. And I'm wondering how you can connect, and I'm going to phrase it in a question, John, because I love the community part and I love the intellectual part, but where does the mystery come in?
But does that have include the premise that if you enter an estuary,
Yes.
you accept the premise that there is something higher, and it's about establishing the connection with that?
Well, to make it more blunt, the only purpose why there is estuary is the biggest place of life and death on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
It's where everything gets eaten, gets reproduced. It's all there. That's the estuary. Huh? I think you've thought through all these different biological metaphors already, John. So that will work. But it's the mystery of life that takes place. And what I like about Paul's channel is, especially when you do the interviews, is you let people talk. And it's the expectation that something of that mystery will come from the other person. The place is neutral, I agree with that. But we are not neutral. We are one side and the other. Even if we're both Christian, doesn't matter. We're one side and the other, and there's something happening there. There's something coming together, and it's the most exciting place that you can be. And why is it exciting? Because something of the mystery of life comes through. And I'm convinced that my church is a temporal expression of that. At one point in time, we thought thoughts about it. And you guys need to make up your own mind as to how that will develop in the future. So I'm open to learning how you guys will develop that. But what I'm very much concerned about is if we focus on the things that we did well as Protestants and forget the one that Orthodoxy and Catholicism still are very strong.
Would that include, sorry to jump on that, would that include the aspects that we've lost in Protestantism? Sweeping statement, I know, but sound, smell, art, that sort of, that aspect.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't hear that not being a part of the description per se, like also the John's mention of the actionable, the praxis, the almost as if through higher power, like the mystery is in there, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So, and I particularly like the actionable part, because I sometimes kind of wonder if what we have is conversation, not saying that can change us, but at some point you're all still really in that mental space, like you pointed out. When does it move to the practical space of, well, let's go do something as a community within the space that we inhabit? But then at the same time, I'm wondering if I'm just not reinventing something else. I don't know, and that's kind of a meta question. I wonder about, like, why is this not there yet? Why is it being created now? The idea of estuary, why doesn't it exist already if it is something that is so needed and apparently something that we are missing? Does that make any sense?
Totally. It makes total sense to me. Especially when you say, why has it not existed all along? And we're not really saying that it hasn't existed before, because it may have existed in other forms and in other ways in which different institutions allowed for different people to bring their existential concerns to the table and to engage with that.
Yeah.
But it is also true that we have gotten into a point where I mean, I like to say maybe all churches, but maybe you're right, maybe it's more Protestant churches, sort of kind of removed themselves a little bit from some of the realities of life and no longer were accessible to the ordinary people to find that kind of community and to engage in conversation about the big questions of life, unless they fully subscribe to the tenets of that particular faith. Mm-hmm. So what I hear you say, it sounds too Protestant. I'm almost tempted to, in a kind of a smart aleck way, to say yes, as a matter of fact, Calvinist, because I'm not so sure that we can summon the mystery of God but we can certainly allow for the mystery of God to appear and to emerge and to show up in whatever setting we create in our conversation and our trust and our mutual appreciation of one another. Because I think it's in that context that oftentimes we find that, we can talk about it in highly spiritual terms, the Spirit moves and we see something is revealed to us, or we hear something and we hear something in another person's statement. It's possible for the mystery of God to find expression in those situations. I'm not sure that we want to be responsible for making it happen. It's like we create a setting and then we trust God to take over as he or she sees fit. Does that help?
I think it does, but I'd like to ask Aaron a little bit about why he is so enthusiastic about a different kind of language that, for instance, Kastrup is using to sort of describe the things that we are experiencing in church, but somehow our language has sort of excluded people from entering that experience.
Right. So I've been rewatching some of John Vervaeke's episodes on Awakening of the Meaning Crisis, and particularly his episode on romanticism was very revealing for me, because it showed how he shows very well how these words we have, such as awesome or love, how they've been very much degraded over the last few centuries. And therefore, and now I realize, like, when you show up with those terms that are very clearly in the Bible, that are so rich, that are like this universal language through which you can speak with people that lived thousands of years ago, essentially, I now feel like, nah, but that's just like, that's romantic comedy. Like it I don't know, it's cringy to me almost to use that language of faith, hope, and love. Less and less so nowadays. But especially when I started on this journey, I was so thankful that someone like Jordan Peterson was using evolutionary biology, and that people were coming through this through the lens of psychedelic drugs. I was very enthusiastic about that, even though I'm now fairly critical of using especially psychedelic drugs as your only lens to arrive at these types of conversations. So in that sense, to answer your question, like, I'm concerned that the people you want to draw in, and if you want to draw them in from outside the church, you're gonna need to change that language aspect to it a little bit, and it can know. And therefore, I think your question is quite relevant. Like, does it need to include the premise of encountering this higher power? Is that already too much, or can it be? That's why we're talking about egregores now and all such things on the channel. Like, what is it exactly that we want to uncover here, and how are we going to use language that is both neutral enough that we can draw in people that might really not want to be affiliated with the church, especially with the rise of the no affiliation with the nuns, but also indeed at the same time that it does show that it has that promise of, but you're going to begin to encounter those things. And I think you've said before that something what Peterson does, that like he doesn't actually cross over himself fully into Christianity, but he holds open the door for other people. So I would like it to be that place, but where do you find that tension specifically? And I think it is indeed very much related to language. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, but I think you're connecting a few things that I was trying to make, but not that well. Is I think the sense of awe and the sense of spirituality is not dependent on the Christian part in the estuary.
Right. I see
It
what you
is
mean.
within the other as well, and I think the way that you do your interviews brings that out in people. I think you embody that, and so I've come. Some of my kids want to be associated with Christianity. More of them do not want to do that. That's something of a difficult bit for me. But what I make of it is that I say, well, my faith is a toolkit, and I really know how to use these tools. I'm not going to impose them on you. But really, learning from Jesus gives me the toolkit to discover something of that which we cannot speak of. And I would love for this to be part of the conversation with other people, wherever they come from, because I think all of us are avenues into that. So that's where I was coming from.
I see.
I'd also like to comment about the mystery, because pastorally, I've often said that In this little corner of the internet, we are often up here in the thinky-talky stuff. And Estuary can be very thinky-talky and go into his AlsNet groups. Myopic mental meanderings. And this little corner has tended to be predisposed to people who are probably a little bit smarter, a little bit better educated, all of those things. Pastorally, most people come to me with a problem. And that problem is an embodied manifestation. And usually somewhere in the problem, that mystery that you're talking about is at work. That mystery might be at work in someone's addiction. They're looking for something, or they're avoiding something, and hence the addiction comes into play. And so pastorally, part of our toolkit has always been, in pastoral care, we begin a conversation. And often it's one-on-one, and sometimes it's confidential and private. And you begin to draw out that mystery. And of course, as a pastor, at some point, the living Christ is going to come in, the power of the Holy Spirit, all of these other things. And so part of estuary is its limit. Every estuary, even very large ones that we've driven through yesterday, estuaries always have limits. Because something without limit, well, that's much more the sea. Estuaries always have limits. And so at a certain point, I would have to say, you've sort of reached the limit of the estuary. And if you want to get into the embodied, the symbolically embodied of really what I'm talking about, you're going to have to go through another door.
Yeah.
And that's where the church is. But I also believe that in almost every problem that a parishioner might come to me, even if they have a very low IQ, even if they don't read books, mystery is at work there in that pain, or perhaps in a malformed attempt to address this dysfunction. And so I see, even in the process of a good conversation, the hope that mysteries are received, approached with fear and trembling, but they're sacred things, and so therefore, by definition, they are things that we can't wield, manage, or handle. And so if Estuary can open a door to say, you're onto something here, but we don't have the tools here to really manage that. Good, Joe.
Right, yes. The Discord was partially created to give the people a space who we would find who would say, I ran into Peterson, I'm having all these new thoughts, nobody around me thinks about these things or wants to think about these things, and maybe there's a space. How am I going to find anybody? And that kind of goes back to my question of why is this space not here already? And I had a larger point that's kind of slipped out of my brain since. That's annoying, that sometimes happens. What were we talking about earlier?
Mystery?
What I think Peterson did is he will point something out, and then you find yourself going into a type of conversation that you otherwise would probably not go into. I don't know if any of you watched the conversation that he had with Dawkins. Now, to a degree, Dawkins kind of says repeatedly, I don't know what you're on about, that seems kind of far-fetched. But at some point, there was a point in that conversation where Peterson goes into talking about a particular type of spirit that seems to be apparent across time. And Dawkins actually seriously engaged with that point and came to a conclusion about, well, that spirit would have to be very old, would have to have existed like pre-humanity, it would have had to always be forming and shaping. And then Peter's like, yeah, and Dawkins like, well, that would be a problem. And I think you said, not for me. But what we saw is that for Dawkins, who would normally perceive such things as straight up woo, and all the blast shields would go up, he engaged with it. And I think a lot of us who came to the Discord through your videos, through Vervaeke's work, and by length Peterson's work, had that same experience of, hey, but why is there nobody else interested in this? And
Right.
and why do I keep running into religious traditions when I do find people?
I would also just quickly add to that, like, to also answer your question in that same vein, I happen to not have a lot of religious friends. So whenever you come to me with that language, I'm like, it's nice. This was a good conversation. See you later. And then,
Yeah, I leave the translation to you.
and then, but then indeed, like when we have these types of conversations, I actually feel very motivated to like, I'm gonna share this with my atheist friends now, you know, and it's actually exciting. I'm like, yeah, because they have to follow along this scientific argument I'm making, and then like, but we don't know what that means, and it's exciting because there is a mystery there. So you're entirely right. Like I can't make the assumption at the start that there's a mystery, but I can point them to it through that new language, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's also
And it's not even a subtle bait and switch. It's more so that isn't this weird?
yeah, exactly.
You know, like no, it's not weird. Like yeah, it's pretty weird. And I'm pretty sure we can explain why that stuff is there to begin with. And
Yeah, we're not Jesus smuggling yet. Like we're just indeed saying like, what? It's
Well,
weird.
you're
yeah,
mystery
I mean, but
smuggler.
I would have. I would have hated to be Jesus smuggled. So I really don't like doing it.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
I don't think I do it to begin with, but like that, and that's I think John, in your estuaries, do you see that type of conversation about that weird stuff, that wonder, that mystery? Or sorry if I'm leading the witness. Or is it more about what's going on in our lives? Or
Well, specifically to your question, I do not see the kind of movement that maybe I would like to see, in which the estuary is kind of a gateway through that intermediate place, either going this way or that way.
no, but it's a connection to other people that
Yes.
think about those things.
Yes, and as such, I have found, I'm strictly speaking from my experience now, I have found that the conversation tends to start at a somewhat ethereal level,
Mm-hmm.
and then moves to a more what context we share, and then even go a little bit more personal, and then people start to take notice of where they are. We're kind of like a little community here. Somebody drinks coffee and cookies, and so then there is the realization, and I think that's kind of where the mystery comes in. We actually kind of care about each other. We are actually kind of, there's a connection forming between us. And I noticed on the wall here that connecting is one of the hallmarks of this seminary. So I'm assuming that God has something to do with
Sarah
that.
now because she knows this one.
Did you put that thing on the wall upstairs?
Not personally.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. So no, but the idea that connection, by definition, has kind of a mystery to it. When Sarah and Boss met, there was a connection there, and it was a mystical connection, was it not? And I think that we don't need to really get too fuzzy spiritual about that, but to affirm that there is stuff going on there that we don't understand, and that it has a bigger meaning than the nuts and bolts that we can put in a row. And then if you can think about that in a slightly bigger context, now we're saying, okay, well, it's not just the two of us who care about each other in a mystical way, but this group cares about each other in a mystical way, and maybe we can care about bigger things in the world in a mystical way. And then we may even begin to think about what mystery are we actually talking about? Mm-hmm. Where does mystery come from? Well, we'll send them all to Paul. He's the preacher.
Well, that's an interesting point, because if I'm taking the seat of someone who has a local church, is a part of the council, I think. What's the name of the people that have
Elders and deacons?
Elders and deacons.
Yeah,
Let's
the
say
kerkraad.
the kerkraad. Thank you.
Church council, yeah.
Yeah, church council. Okay, good. Let's say I'm one of those people, and I'm listening to this conversation. I'm thinking, well, that mystery better lead to Jesus, because Otherwise, we have a problem here. What would be your response to that question?
Why are you so afraid it won't?
Yeah, time frame.
Well, that's a good counter question, actually. Why shouldn't I be afraid?
Because the profession of the church is that Christ is, in fact, where we are heading and what we are drawn to and the fullness of life. And so I don't think the church should be embarrassed about saying that. Now, to understand that, let's say someone has an addiction. They go to AA. They talk about a higher power. Sometimes churches kind of poo-poo, higher power isn't fat enough, isn't firm enough, isn't specific enough. Okay, but we're dealing with an addiction here, okay? So let them deal with that. The track record, in my experience, of people who begin in AA and wind up in the church is really very good. And they find sobriety along the way. And one of the best friends I had in my congregation, he's passed now, but he was in AA for decades, and he said, okay, my alcoholism has been under control for a good long time now. But there's a lot more. AA has put me on a path to not only address sobriety, but my relationships with other people. And what he found in the church was a larger playing field, because actually when he died, his wife found some, his addiction kind of got transferred over to food, got transferred over to cameras, got transferred over to screwdrivers. This guy never fixed anything. He had 2 toolboxes full of screwdrivers. His wife's like, what's this? So the church offers a much larger playing field. And I fully know, given all of my experience with conversations on YouTube, again, we've got part of the blessing of this as a pastor is we've got people in the room. My Iron Root Manuel was in the basement of Bridges of Meaning Discord server for a while, and that wasn't working for him. And he went out and did some meditation with Vervaeke into the other server, and that kind of sparked something for him. But then, and we can let him tell his own story. But as a pastor, you regularly find people in the process of sorting themselves out. There are a lot of interesting detours. And as a pastor, you understand you're going to have to let those people take those detours in order to find their way. And the wise pastor, I believe, hopefully will have faith that it is, in fact, Christ calling them. And I think for churches to be, I think they have too little faith. Yeah.
Well, there is no part of reality of which God doesn't say mine.
Abram Kuyper.
That's true.
So I think I understand the concerns that churches have. Mm-hmm. But I have seen the Christian Reformed Church had, we baptize the children. The congregation makes vows. We have nursery for them. We have Christian day school. We have Sunday school. The irony for me has always been this Christian tradition that speaks about, it's the sovereignty of God and the quickening of the Holy Spirit. We sure are putting a lot of bumpers on this lane for the kids here because we want to keep them in. When you often find that it is, God often uses very strange paths to make some of his greatest saints. Look at Augustine. Just go through the history of the church. And so I think churches need a little bit of faith that at the end, when they begin to approach the mystery, I think Christians say, well, we've got some names for that. And to have a little confidence in that.
When you're describing what the church does, it seems very, as many of our friends here would say, doelbewust, purposeful activity. Very intentional, aligning the spirits and aligning the path and making sure things go this way. And I would say that perhaps one of the strengths of Estuary, as I experience it, is to doelbewust get out of the way. Very intentionally and purposefully get out of the way of how God is going to work in this person's life and say, that is not up to me to control, that is not up to me to manipulate, that is not up to me to navigate, But if I can get myself out of the way, me and my agenda, my own personal agenda, and let God take charge of this situation, then a mystery may very well reveal itself in that person's life, in our relationship, and in our togetherness. And that's kind of where I see that mystery popping up.
Wonderful. May I add something to that?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yes.
Because we're doing several things as a church or a group of churches in our hometown. Zin Café, which means meeting together by discussing some things with a purpose. It's already going on. It's been established by the Council of Churches, but they have invited other people to join the organization, and that creates a space where people talk. For instance, I had the opportunity to talk about the concept of, love in the economy. What is love a productive factor in the economy? So that was an interesting one. My wife is part of Samen aan tafel, eating together. And that was established especially because a lot of people didn't go to church. Right. But they are in your neighborhood, so the neighborhood was important. Mm-hmm. And of course we facilitated it from the church, but if a group would go on its own, we wouldn't control that. Mm-hmm. And during Corona crisis, we've found out that we could broadcast our services, church services, and some of these people started to watch them. And now they're in church. Having said that, though, I think if we talk about the mystery, Jesus says, "When did you meet me?" When you came to me when I was naked, or you came to me when I was in prison, etc. He's not saying he will reveal himself through Christians to non-Christians. He actually says to his followers, "I will reveal myself through non-followers to you." So that is a mystery that we cannot fathom how much there is. So I believe Jesus is less particular about these things than churches tend to be.
In our church, they call those same dinner groups, "It's just dinner."
It's just dinner, and then we smuggle it in.
It's more than dinner. Right.
Food for thought.
Yeah, right. Okay. Sorry, sir.
No, thank you so much. What do you think about that, Job? Do you have any thoughts?
I have some. I wonder which one are the wisest to voice. I tried to run an estuary once with my church, with my pastor really, because we figured we need a neutral space. I happened to be able to use the local fire department, which is a stone's throw away from the church. But then still we flyered, we tried to get the word out. Very few people came. 2 people came. And we had 2 meetings. And what I noticed both is I would have a particular thing that I would have liked to discuss, like, why is a particular act not an example of moral behavior? And it turned out most of the discussions were like what was going on in our lives and how to be a good employer. And it turned out, I kind of just realized as I was listening to this, we were discussing moral behavior. It's not in a very strict philosophical way that I was conceptualizing it back then. And it was more of a question I was going to present to the group, is because you said something, John, about kind of letting it do its thing, kind of let the waters go and let things mix. Is there, in your experience, ever a type of steering, formalization necessary within Estuary, or is it just a sort of free-for-all?
You're actually asking about the Estuary protocol. Thank you for asking that. I was looking for an opportunity to bring that up. So the Estuary protocol was designed specifically to make it possible for the leader to not have to prepare. And I am somewhat lazy, so I prefer to not have to prepare a lesson. But that is the nonsense way of saying it. The real genius behind the Estuary protocol is that it makes both everybody responsible and it gives everybody the opportunity to put on the table what they would like to talk about. So my opening question for every meeting is, so since the last time we were together, what have you been thinking about whether it be myopic mental meanderings, intellectually, or contextually, what's happening in your hometown. Was there an election or a flood or a fire or a
Protest.
Yeah, right. Protest, freeway closure, and but contextually. So we got intellectually, contextually, personally. We may not end up discussing this at length, but did you just have a baby, or did you lose your mom, or did you get a new job, or did you have to move to a different town, or these things matter in our lives. So feel free to share with one another. Then you elevate the level of personal familiarity with people, which makes the mystery somehow come alive a little bit more. And then finally, estuarily, if you want to say something about how we run our group, maybe you would like to get a new leader, depose one and get, replace me with somebody else. I say, we can talk about the length of the meeting, or who should bring the refreshments, or we should have better refreshments, we should have pizza instead of cookies. All those things can be discussed. We put that on the table, and then for the next round, we look at what's on the table. Oh, by the way, we take full responsibility for listening carefully to what each person says, because for the next round, of all the things that are on the table, we are going to state, if it were up to me, I heard so-and-so say this or that. I would like to explore that further. And as a matter of fact, that had something to do with what so-and-so said. So these two things combined, or maybe three, they seem like a great topic for us for the remainder of our time together. Well, what does this mean? That means that no one brings an agenda. People bring what they have thought about in the intervening time. That becomes stuff on the table, intellectually, contextually, personally, estuarily, and now we can proceed with whatever the group decides as a group, very democratic, what we want to pick up from the table and elevate to become the topic of our conversation. So that then gives some shape and structure to the conversation.
And based on your experience, because earlier Paul talked about the YouTube churn, have you found that people come back because of that format, because of how these estuary conversations go?
I need to give an honest answer to that.
Please.
At ELSNet, which is a highly motivated group of people, these are the estuary leaders that I train online, they come back. In my home church estuary, we have a space in our church set aside to give a space for the estuary. Up until the last two meetings, we had consistent attendance from mostly the same people. And then vacation kind of kills it. And Paul and I have talked about this together. We both have had numerous experiences where you organize something and nobody shows up. It's a really very unnerving kind of experience. But you get used to it. And so the very last meeting before this one, nobody showed up. So,
but it's hard. I mean,
it is hard.
I mean, you're sitting there, watching their door, having the cookies there or the pizza, whatever you prepared.
Yep. It was not easy, but I'm used to it sufficiently that I didn't change the schedule on the meetups, on the meetup.com calendar. The future meetings are planned, scheduled, and will continue. And I may have to make a few phone calls and hey, I need you to be here. But I think that the thing has enough life in it that will come back to fruition. But the topic of conversation, I'm not that worried about that.
Okay.
Because that has a life of its own almost of each meeting when we are together.
Sure, but that means that works. Sorry, no, go ahead.
I liked this very much about his description. He called it democratic, but it's actually spiritual.
It's organic.
Yeah, it grows. And I like the fact that you say, do not come here, but because democratic often is political, often is power. And that's not what you're doing. You're not creating power structures. You're not having a gang that wants to always discuss this or always discuss that. You say first listen to each other and then see what happens with you. And I think that's very, very beautiful.
Yes, it is. But I also, in doing so, empower each individual, each participant to take active role in making the thing happen. So there is a little bit of a power thing happening. I agree with you, but more of the power lies in the listening. I agree with you.
It's because we're like lobsters. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Well, and one of the beautiful things is that, so Job comes to the Estuary meeting. He's really burning with something. He wants to talk about this. So he puts it on the table. Maybe nobody picks it up, but it's if you're going to pick something off at the table, my rule is always you have to choose someone else's topic that you're interested in.
Yeah.
You don't just come here with your topic. This is what I want to talk about. Well, just go somewhere else. Find someone who's willing to listen to you. I bet you have a hard time with that. And again, to me, part of this, I think people have a little bit difficulty locating this. As a pastor, people imagine, look at a pastor and think, pastors are there to tell people what to do and what they should think. That's what people think pastors do. Most of what pastors do...
What gave them that thought?
I don't know. Well, because a lot of pastors act that way. I'll grant that. But as a pastor, most of what I do is listen to people. Their complaints, their fears, their gripes. And now I as a pastor can do that, and that's fine. That's my job. And maybe at the end I might have a little word for them. They usually won't listen to it anyway, but we'll see. In a group, suddenly, and we've done this in small groups, church has done this for a long time in lots of different ways, but now suddenly as a group, I've come to this group and I've got this, and I'd like to talk about it. And then someone across the group says, hey, you know what? I'd like to talk about that too. Now there's a connection. Two people want to talk. There's a few other people, and maybe it's not the most interesting thing on the table tonight, but next week, maybe theirs will get picked up. And then at some point, the Estuary group says, we just talk. Why don't we go, and because often a lot of our Estuary groups are full of men, and then the men will be, why don't we, the church is looking kind of, there's a problem over there. We don't have any benches, so our Estuary group made benches. Because let's not just talk, let's do something together. And we did something together. And then it grows. So there's a lot of potential here. But so much of it is just based on, does someone care? Well, how do I know? How do I know they care? They've listened. It just starts that small.
Paul, time out?
Yeah.
Why men? I mean, I'm looking at the audience there. I don't know if you guys look at yourself sometimes, but you all seem to be men. I'm just informing you.
Because I'll tell you something. One of our church plants bought a Lutheran church that was dying and going out. And one of the conditions, the church gave them a really great price on the facility. You know what it was? Can our women's group continue to meet here? The church died and the women's Bible study endured. At Living Stones, we've had all kinds of things. But I'll tell you, the women have been doing this well for a very long time.
This is the normal experience of churches since Paul, is that women carry the community of the church.
Yep.
And then if it gets big enough, they allow some guy to preach. And then afterwards, the guys think they're in control and they're actually doing that. Now, for a very long time, if you look at baptismal registries, you see women, well, all got baptized, but they did the confession of faith. So you saw women in majorities doing that as opposed to men. And so what's so interesting is why this particular discussion, phenomenon, seems to attract men. This may be something worthwhile exploring. That's why I said time out. I'm getting you off your direction here. But
I heard there's more girls on Tumblr and more men on YouTube. That's the reason Peter Snow gives for it. I don't think that's true, but yeah.
It is true.
I think it's true.
Okay. Fair enough.
Well, Sarah, I mean, you've been asking the questions here. What do you think of this?
I think women are more focused on relations. For me, I'm mostly interested in the personal stories of people. And I also happen to like the intellectual side of things, but I think that's more of a quirk than something that women in general find interesting. So I think it's one of those things. This is something I think that males are simply more drawn to, and I think women have other places where they gather I don't really see that as a problem. I mean, women are welcome. I feel welcome here. I don't. There's this thing that some people think they should do things to attract women to go somewhere, but I always feel disempowered when they do that, because I think I can go wherever I want. Any woman can go where they want these days. That's not entirely true, of course, but I think it's fine. If women want to show up, they show up. They're welcome. And I think the Estuary hosts are very able to make them feel welcome.
It may actually be the invention of the millennium, because so far the church has been able to thrive because of women, just as you explained, and men often do not get to explore those depths that women do explore. So maybe this is something that is really needed. If you said something that wasn't there before, well, speak for your gender, I would say. There may be a lot of that already going on between in churches where there are a lot of women discussing these things. Not just these things, these topics. Every group does it in its own way. But what is rather unique is that men feel. We should actually ask the audience almost. That men feel touched and interested, cry sometimes even when I see these biblical lecture series from Jordan Peterson. You see the question and answers afterwards. You see people choking up, tears in their eyes, etc. This is touching something, and I'm curious as to why.
I have another theory about it, but that's all it is. It's just a theory. But I actually heard some of that language from Jordan Peterson, and that is that our society has, in fact, for whatever reason, come to empower women to take charge and to be in control and to get the attention and to get the, and so there is a little thing out there that suggests that men in the last maybe 100 years have kind of been losing ground, in the sense that many more women go to college, many more women have increasingly higher paying jobs. Men feel a little bit left behind, so there is this whole narrative of toxic masculinity that kind of puts a negative light on men, and men feel a little victimized by that, I presume. And so I can easily imagine that there would be a group of guys that say, well, we need some safe space for ourselves.
Wow.
And I don't know if that's true in Estuary in general. I don't know if that's true for this particular audience. But I do believe that there are places where the presence of women, your presence to the contrary notwithstanding, we love you, but that sometimes women can be a little bit overpowering, and that it might be nice to have a space where men can kind of hear themselves think without female influence. And
could I maybe nuance it a little bit in that I think
as the women want.
That men are also very much willing, at least I'm speaking in rough generalizations, of course, because not all men are equal, but the decent men that I've met, they are very willing to accommodate any woman that's part of the conversation, perhaps even more than the men that are present. So I think the presence of women in a conversation also influences the behaviors of the men, but in a more positive way, in that they want to make the woman feel comfortable, and that also means that they have to prohibit some of the things they want to say because they don't want to offend or anything. Mm-hmm. So that is something that at least I personally have noticed, not necessarily in the context of Estuary, but maybe more with colleagues and friends.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that, like, it seems that this is in some sense obviously a counter movement, like Estuary, even though I don't think we'd like to discuss it that way because we want it to be productive, but it's also a counter movement in some ways. And that, you know, lots of the ways in which it is a counter movement is that you have a culture that is very enthusiastic about promoting compassion, and also, well, they're not promoting relativism, but they're saying you should be compassionate towards everyone, you should be tolerant towards everyone. And I think like no one will disagree with that. But by promoting it so much, it's like, wait, but that was originally like the role of the church. So what is the church then still doing? And that's also why someone like Peterson has been saying, well, the church should now be focusing on responsibility, like something entirely different. And it seems that for that reason that this might be a space that, since those conversations about compassion and, you know, be tolerant towards everyone are had already in the mainstream culture, think about your mental health, all those aspects, that they're like these counter spaces, they're much more about, no, okay, well, that's already happening there. Let's just talk about, you know, theories and intellectual, heady stuff, if that makes sense. And I'm not saying that's particularly a good thing, because you want those to balance out. And I think that's what you're raising very correctly, that ideally you'd have those two. But that's why, indeed, if these spaces get characterized by that, it's not just that it's a safe space, it's also that it's a reaction, I guess, in some sense, to the dominant culture of the time. Yeah, I don't know.
Would the odd question perhaps, do you think that the people in your Estuary group who went to build benches, I think you said,
Yeah.
would they still have done that if there were women in that group, assuming there aren't any?
I've run a lot of different groups for men and for women. The cultures are very different. Women care if there are tablecloths and cookies. Every week I go, and I'm the only man at the women's Bible study. I'm only there for the beginning, and then I leave because I don't want to run it. But the cultures are very different. Men and women approach things differently. Not all men, not all women, but
If you put a bunch of them together, you tend to see a difference.
Exactly, that's exactly right.
No, but I mean, but the same thing. Like, I'm assuming, for one, the choice to build benches. I don't know. I have no idea what these benches were like, but I'm assuming they just grabbed some random tree, cut it down, and
Well,
built
to be
benches.
honest, first we had this tree that had to be cut down, and
They took care of that.
and we had put out and said, we got to cut this tree down. You guys interested? Yeah. That sounds like fun.
But I mean, so I'm kind of trying to figure out, so what happens to the people who aren't like woodworkers or aren't particularly handy, or, you know, are more in their head and maybe not so much in their hands?
Oh, not everybody came to build the benches. I
Right,
mean, some people are much more there for the head,
Yeah.
and some people are more there for the hands. As Protestants, we tend to be more up here in the head, and so we need a little bit more hand stuff. Another element that I did want to bring in, though, which came out in my group too, was a number of the young men basically said, I come to this group to have relationships with older men. And because, well, I've got my father, and I think one of the most important videos on my channel, one of the most important conversations on my channel, was my first conversation with John, where he shared his story, because this is deeply in John's story about, it wasn't until his 50s that he discovered that he had been fathered all along by a whole series of men throughout his life. And I think the question you asked earlier about, well, where has this been? I think this function has been in our world in working areas. I just read an article just last week on how workplace friendships are sort of coming apart for a whole variety of reasons. Partly because, you know, post-COVID, more and more people are working at home, very convenient. But I found in these groups, what a lot of the men are looking for is, are there some older men who, maybe they're not as old as my dad, maybe they're a little different from my dad, and, you know, they're not going to be my father, but, you know, Grim Grizz calls Jordan Peterson Papa Peterson for a group of, he was the dad or he's the uncle, and so.
So then I would say estuaries do exist.
Yes.
They do pre-exist in that sense. I mean, I can give an example. I'm when I joined the fire department, I'm a software engineer, you know. I'm not really cut out to be a firefighter by default. But when we had to, like, you know, in case you have a house that's on fire, you have the risk of the walls collapsing. So you learn how to very quickly, from some materials you have, build a supporting base. And, all right, here's wood, here's hammer, get to work. Like, okay, let's see how Job holds a hammer. No, that's not how you hold a hammer. Suddenly, I had 10 dads saying, this is how you do it. Don't worry, we'll teach you. You come help me fix my printer. But it doesn't just stop there, right? Because then afterwards, when you're done training, you have a drink together, but you also have conversations like, "Hey, how's your kid doing?" Or "Hey, I saw you, work in the garden, doing a little project." Or "Hey, Joe, can you come help me fix my printer?" So, but also theology, that also happens there. My particular fire department happens to be quite religious, but so I'm trying to figure out why then the people that we find navigating towards Estuary don't navigate towards let's say volunteer clubs like fire departments, who are really usually chomping at the bit for new young people to get into their leagues.
Estuary is tiny. I think people are finding these things in all different places. And so I think for a lot of people downstream from Jordan Peterson, maybe because people have found this in other ways too besides Peterson, it's another example in the far larger world of where these needs get met. Part of my attention has been to, because I'm a pastor, because I have colleagues, because I have seen from the inside how churches have not been able to make themselves available to those needs. You know what? This potentially, we've done harvest festivals, we've done vacation Bible schools. Yeah. Churches have done all sorts of gimmicks just to get people in the door. And many of these things I did, no decent conversation came out of it. Mm. And now suddenly people are coming in and, you know what I'd really like to do? I got some questions for you, Pastor. And sometimes they've got an edge on it. Me, I like that. Because that edge means they care. Mm. Yeah. And I don't think in just a few sentences I'm going to dispel that edge, but I don't want to. And that goes back to the mystery. Because the edge also shows that the mystery is working on them. So I'm not going to blunt that edge. I'm going to use that edge and say, keep going with that question. Because behind it, there's a dream or a vision or a longing or a haunting of a better world. And I want you to have a hunger and thirst for that world.
There you go. That's it. It's not here's the thing I want to talk about. Oh, that's interesting. And it's not like this is why you're wrong about that thing you want to talk about. It's like, hey, let's see where that goes. Let's see where that takes you. I think that's a key point.
Yeah. Well, and then what you're saying is that you are appreciating Paul modeling that online. And he does that very well. Paul is the quintessential estuary leader online, with individuals in your random conversations and in other ways also. So then, how can you be sure that other estuary leaders exhibit that kind of behavior?
John now wants us to answer through the protocol.
That is so funny.
No. No, but I have another pet peeve.
Maybe this is a good point to see if our audience has any questions.
He's going to go for his pet peeve.
No, I just want to put in a plug for Elsnet.
So, if you... No.
Precisely. Because the truth of the matter is that it does help if there is somebody in the group who can model that kind of behavior, exhibit that kind of behavior. And so Paul and I said right from the start, Paul said if this thing is that they have any kind of legs at all, it has to create some infrastructure. Yeah. We have to find some way of training leadership, and I can't do that. I'm too busy talking and making videos. So John, you do that. And that's kind of how our cooperative relationship in this thing started. But all I really do is I just invite people to become comfortable with the estuary protocol. That's all that Elsnet is. Elsnet is a way for people to get together, and right now there are people worldwide, that are doing this. But from one point of view, you can say, well, that is a lot. That is a big development. That is enormous. 60 people have signed up to be leaders of an estuary group. Wow. No, 60 people is nothing. Because, like Paul said, the whole estuary movement is a very small thing. but it helps to see how it compares with larger cultural patterns and movements. And I think you picked up on that very well, is that there are other ways in which, you know, people get their camaraderie and their sense of male role modeling in other settings. What we do in Estuary is just to contribute a little bit more to that and create some people who emulate the kind of listening skills and gathering skills that we learn in seminary, I guess. As small group leaders,
We learn from the church.
Yeah, we learn within
Seminary doesn't teach you that.
No, but within, as part of our pastoral training and our pastoral career, you learn a few tricks about how to run a meeting. And so this is kind of what we do at Elsnet, and we practice that together. And so you can have a little sense that when people say, "Hey, I'm ready to start an estuary group in my town," and you can say, "Well, I know how you participate in our group online. I'm going to sign off on that, and there you go. We put you on Elsnet or on estuaryhub.com as a registered group."
And maybe then opening it to the floor, go back to your question, what do you say to churches that are perhaps reluctant to offer this space and this expertise?
And we know they are reluctant.
Yeah, but we actually found something here that says churches have been not very good in opening this gateway for people. The fact that the demographics are slightly different, tells us that this is something that should be added to what we do. And then even if it's small, it's actually capturing some people who are otherwise not being served. So that will be an answer to your question for the churches.
Thank you. All right. So what do you say? Shall we open the floor to the audience?
Sounds good.
How do we handle that with the microphone?
Speak up.
Speak up, yeah.
Speak up, or you can come over
We
here.
can repeat
and,
the question also.
Yeah,
We can also put you on a seat right there. We can put an extra seat there.
That'd be the hot seat.
Yeah.
I'm not completely sure on that, but at the moment there isn't really a protocol, so. But yeah, it does sound like those footholds might be useful, because if you want to promote this at your church, I'm like, yeah, well, how exactly do you get this through the church council? Is there something, something you can provide to them to?
So the question is how to promote this with your church council, like how do you
Yeah.
actually get through them to establish this, right? Yeah.
That's a good question. Personally, in the Christian Reformed Church in North America, I would, if there's a church that's interested, I'll talk to the pastor. And but I can't do that in every case. We have had some churches with some reluctance and some pushback. We just recently had a church register on estuaryhub.org or .com. So there are, I think at some point we may do a video to address church concerns. Quite frankly, a big criticism I have of churches in North America is they're too fearful and they're too timid. I look at something like this and I say, tell me what the worst is you're imagining and what do you have going right now? Because I don't see a lot. And if they had a lot going right now, they probably wouldn't be even thinking about it. They'd be busy doing what they're doing. Yeah. So I think generally speaking, though, if a member that the church cares about and trusts says, I want to try this thing, a lot of churches hopefully will say, we trust you, we care about you. What is he asking for? A room? A space? Is that really so hard when most of our rooms sit empty? How many nights a week? So, but I know in the past though, others I've seen churches be reluctant.
I think that one of the hardest things to overcome is the conviction that many church leaders have, whether they be pastors or elders, is that we have a responsibility to urgently proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ and his salvation. To urgently proclaim, not cultivate an audience, not see what kind of questions are out there, but we are mandated to urgently, in season and out of season, proclaim the riches of the gospel of Jesus Christ unto salvation. And there's an energy there. And a lot of pastors feel that is their role, that is their responsibility. A lot of elders feel that that's why they employ pastors, that's what they want to see happen. And so when you say, well, I would like to start a group that basically invites people to bring their concerns to the table and sort out from what's on the table some questions they want to discuss. Why? What is the urgency there to meet Jesus? Why isn't somebody telling them about Jesus? Like as in on the airplane seat, Paul and I did quite a bit of traveling. I arranged it so that the two of us would only have 2 seats side by side us, and so we wouldn't be tempted to want to share the gospel with the people around us in the airplane.
You managed.
So
No, but I get what you're saying. Go on.
So there is a spirit of urgency among many evangelical churches, where if you don't exhibit that kind of an intensity to want to share the gospel with your neighbor, then you're not doing enough. Then you're not doing it right. And so let's not waste resources on this fuzzy neutral stuff. We've got to be out there for Jesus. And that is a hard argument to argue with. I mean, how are you going to say to these elders, well, it's not that urgent. It's not that urgent. We can leave some of this up to God. No, the Lord tells us that we got to be urgent, in season and out of season to defend the hope that is within you.
Yes.
See, but I say, John, for me, this mission is very much in keeping with that. Because Jesus stands up and cries, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." And so I see that urgency, but most of the people in our church know that a word of admonition and even invitation, if not properly understood or properly contextualized, produces resistance and even antagonism. And I think the church has plenty of experience with that. And for that reason, pastoral care usually involves a lot of listening, a lot of patience, and finding that moment. And again, I like really how Bas brought this in. There is a mystery at play here. And mysteries are sacred and holy. You can't really touch them, and you certainly can't wield them, or bad things happen. So John and I have talked about this a lot. The difficulty is that proclamation gets in the way of hearing, and the irony is, none of the churches that I'm dealing with or that I invite to do this are lacking in proclamation. And part of the thing that drew my attention to Jordan Peterson was, here was a guy in Canada renting out this theater, paying for it himself, selling tickets at $40 a pop, every time selling out, people traveling from all over the world to him ramble about the book of Genesis, when I knew colleagues, classmates, and friends of mine in the same city had plenty of empty seats every week. And I had to say, maybe we should shut up and listen and do a little bit of thinking about, clearly these groups of people want to hear something proclaimed. Why aren't they listening to us? So I turn the mirror around and say, maybe I should talk to some people. Maybe I should listen, see what they say. And for me, that involved, most of my channel is me talking, me thinking out loud. Good, bad, right, or wrong. A whole bunch of people tell me exactly what's wrong with it, which is fine. But, okay, tell me what's wrong with it. Let's talk. Maybe I'll learn. And I think the proclamation of Christ happens. One of the things I had early on when I went to college, thinking about do I want to be a Christian? Do I want to remain in this thing? Why doesn't Jesus in the gospel always sound like what sometimes I hear in the church? When this is supposed to be the goal. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Well, when people come to me as a pastor and they have something burning or some problem, they're looking for rest. And I think part of humanity is that we can only rest together. And so that's what I say to pastors.
But you are, of course, preaching to the choir, because
I
I
know
totally
that.
agree with you.
I know
But Job asked, what makes it so difficult? And then I say, it is that other mentality that you have that you bump into that makes it sometimes difficult to convince people that what Paul is proposing is a legitimate way of carrying out the mission of Christ and to provide pastor.
Without the whole proclamation up front. So we were talking about mysteries. So, it used to be a really big mystery how wort, proto-beer, becomes beer. People didn't know that. They only knew that if you left it alone for a good while and didn't touch it and just kind of let it do its thing, eventually you'd have beer. And it kind of seems to me that way. You just, you close that fridge, you keep the temperature level, you kind of let it do its thing. You leave it alone. You don't go, become beer, because it won't. You gotta give it, it's yeast, it's leaven. You gotta kind of let it do its thing and work through the entire liquid.
Yeah,
And then
my daughter
eventually-
did that with berries. They babysitted our house together with her boyfriend,
Mm-hmm.
and then they had all these berries in bottles, and they stored it away.
Yeah.
And we didn't really think about it until it exploded.
Yeah. Okay, that's not the story we
No, that's a metaphor. That's a metaphor. This thing could explode. Right now we're meeting some resistance, but eventually it could explode.
Are you willing to repaint the walls of the church? In case of
No, this is a way of repainting. Everything was purple. But I want to go back to your question, please. Are you in one of these churches that are very much on proclamation, or one of these churches of which we have a lot in the Netherlands that are very timid on proclamation?
Well, I'm from a church that's very much trying to find its own identity currently. We're a bunch of the Dutch Reformed, the actual Dutch Reformed.
The actual one, the real one, before all this. Happy to hear.
The true one.
Yeah, we still have. Now, the reason why I'm asking it is, I guess the analysis very much holds up for evangelical churches and what we would call more reformatorische, so stricter Orthodox Reformed churches in the Netherlands. All the other churches are desperate for being relevant in the society.
Yeah.
So even if your church doesn't say yes to you, you just go to one of these other churches, pick out someone who's your friend, becomes your friend, can happen, and then ask these other churches, because they desperately are in need of becoming relevant. And also in our town we have the Council of Churches, which is always very neutral, and I think the whole neutrality thing is something that's very, very appealing.
Yeah.
So I think there are ways to get that space.
Yeah.
And then there are probably also ways to get some of the experience that you are looking for in team leaders.
There is also one final point that I would like to add. Unfortunately, Stefan Pasi is not here right now, but he has written a paper on this actually. And one of the things he mentions is representation. That Paul in 1 Corinthians sets up this idea of the husband who doesn't believe being blessed by the wife who believes. And he says that also applies to communities where some people do have the faith and others don't. The ones that don't, they do not need to be forced to accept the faith, but they are simply blessed by the ones that do have the faith. And I think that may be comforting to churches who are otherwise hesitant because the faith isn't proclaimed every second, let's say. So, yeah, it's perhaps...
I think there's a group that would be tempted to say yes.
Yeah.
In every town. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So are there maybe any more questions from the audience? Yes.
I think what John said about urgency and what Paul said about patience are both relevant if you think about it as fishing, right? You have to both have the energy to go and fish early in the morning, but you also have the patience to sit there in your little boat, hours and hours. But I think you then, in that context, brought up the most important point of converting the language that we use, the net, to be able to catch the fish, because nowadays, with Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, a lot of people have sort of learn to evade that kind of net and to be afraid of it. And I think it is very important to update those nets, make them better at catching people. But then, what do you guys think about losing something in that conversion process? Because of course the mysterious language is much more appealing, is much more interesting.
Wow, thank you so much. This is the big debate I'm having with this guy.
So I'm gonna shall we repeat the question a bit? Whether we lose something in converting the language to be, would you say, more appealing
neutral?
to a general audience?
Yes, we are losing a lot.
Yeah.
We are losing thousands of years of human experience, layered meanings. It's so beautiful once you get into biblical lectures, once you get into those words. It's astonishingly beautiful. And you lose all that because you're doing some neutral ground. Nevertheless, as Aaron has been teaching me, is you need to have these new words, otherwise people will never go through the gate. And whether or not they will then go in my tradition or toolkit or what have you, I don't know. But at least we've understood that we're touching on the same thing. And then the next step is, and I think John Verveke said this nice, he said, adopt a practice. And one of the most beautiful practices is Judaism, Christianity. It's a very, very healthy practice if it's around what the lens that Jesus gave. So I'm very much not neutral about that. I'd love to speak about that. But I am aware that we've already touched on something that's real. And whether or not they take it up a different practice, they will still teach me things and we will be able to exchange in the estuary. But I'd love them also to learn about the beautiful concepts and language that we share across millennia.
I guess if I could also add
Yeah,
to
yeah,
that
yeah,
a
go
little
ahead.
bit. Well,
It's your
one
point.
reason why I have become interested in Bernardo Kastrup recently is because he, in my opinion, he makes a fairly credible case that our materialist way of looking at the world is baloney. It's like it's full of errors too, and you could still make a division between what's material and what's mind and all that. But still, like, to have that as your fundamental lens through which you perceive the world, there are several errors with it. And I've been talking this over with some of my friends because I don't need to do that from like, well, yeah, but then you miss out on spirits and you miss out on all those things. I can just say like, it's just inconsistent. Like it just doesn't add up if you see all of it together. And then they're a bit more open to like, oh wait, so perhaps some of these, and let's call them for now mental categories, might be better actually to describe what's going on in reality as opposed to these material categories. So I found like a much quicker way, as opposed to this evolutionary biology, and like looking at mathematics and all this, to get at this for those who are interested in it in that way. And now I'm much more interested in that language and also interested in sharing that language because I can get there far like
You
more
first had to
easily,
know
if that
something
makes
was
sense.
there.
Yeah. No, and I know. I'm just saying that,
Yeah,
but
you know
I
that.
need to then convince other people something is there, and then I can be like, and also then it makes sense to use that language. That is like, well, love is just a bunch of molecules popping up. No, that's bullshit. That's just the representation of it. What's fundamental is love, and that's the representation. But we're pretending like the representation is the real thing, and what we call love is actually secondary, and that we got it like exactly the wrong way
That
around.
is not the territory.
Yeah, exactly. So that's it.
One of the things that I would often hear in the Sam Harris type atheist Christian debates is that the church dogma can't be updated. Brett Sockold, a conversation I had early, wrote a book, Transubstantiation, where he basically made the argument that Luther was wrestling with many of the same issues as Aquinas, but some of the language had sort of shifted in terms of what the words meant. Calvin comes along with real presence. And so you have this massive blow up in the church, which C.S. Lewis said probably would have been better behind, in a comfortable room with a warm fire and pipes and, some good drink to sort through that problem. What we're always doing in the church is doing this massive attempt to take the riches of the past and understand them, appreciate them, embody them, and give them to the next generation. And what human beings need to do that is all of what we're doing here. And cutting down trees, building benches, building churches, helping widows and orphans. I mean, this is what we do. This is the process. And Sam had, dogma is always set. No, the church is always reworking these things and saying, how do these things connect now? And what kinds of new challenges do we have? We have, over the last couple of hundred years, radical change in technology. And so what do we do with nitrogen? What do we do with CO2? I mean, all of these things are, to one degree or another, have theological connections that get up into, Castrop is very much upper register. So, so much of this is saying, here are the conversations that we've been having for a very long time. How can we welcome others into the conversation, whether it's sort of at the thinky-talky or whether it's at the bench building, how to put out a fire. And again, but that all takes work. But again, in terms of human beings, if you want attention, if you want care and concern, you've got to begin, by listening, having a space for listening. And then I don't have any concern, given my experience over the last 5 years, that all of these people that are interested in the thinky-talky things will fail to discover the riches of the Christian tradition when, Orthodoxy, Catholicism, Aristotle, Aquinas. Now we're brimming over with people getting excited about esoteric, ancient, philosophical, cultural, symbolic things. That stuff is just welling up out of the conversation.
It is, and it's beautiful.
And I do grant you that, right? Okay.
Okay, so we do lose something.
Yeah.
I think we've established that.
But I also think that if you look at the totality of our conversation, it seems so clear to me that there is a kind of a progression, and that perhaps if the listening is done well in the estuary, and the estuary becomes an inviting space where some people can feel free to hear themselves think and talk, it doesn't mean that they have to stay in the estuary. That's why an estuary, and I have often said it in those words, is church adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
So while we might want to emulate some kind of neutrality, it's nevertheless in the outer court, of the temple. It's kind of attached to the church. And so it allows the church to be church more fully almost, to be more sacramental, to be more mysterious, mystery focused. And then the estuary can be kind of a passageway, or I've heard use the word gateway, could become a kind of a pathway to the greater mystery. Again, you can't push people, you can, but at least that opportunity exists. And so, that would be another way to defend it against detractors, I presume.
So you might do something in the process, but not in the end necessarily, because, right? Okay.
Right. There was another question.
I hear people talking about luring and catching. But what about finding? And the mystery and the magic, we're pretending as if it doesn't exist right here, right now.
Exactly.
Don't you have to want to see it? And if you can go out there and find those things and bring them in and promote them, wouldn't that be a way of updating things? The things that honor the old, but in a new way. There are plenty of people who celebrate wonderful things, but if you don't want to find them, if you don't want to see them, if you want to believe everything is cynical, then of course that's all you're going to see. So aren't there things out there that could be found rather than caught or lured?
Oh yes. Oh yes. No, I very much agree. And part of the reason we get a little cautious about the caught and lured, even though it's a very biblical language, is it's not a fish on a hook or a fish in a net. It's actually so Bern Powers, we'll see him at the German conference. He's the anadromist. He swims upstream. I mean, that's the image he takes. One of the beautiful things about, let's say, salmon in the Pacific and the Western United States, they're sometimes in the ocean, and they're spawning upstream, and they're moving, and they're finding, and they're seeking. Those are also deep Christian language. And the invitation is, knock and the door will be open. Ask and it will be given. Seek and you will find. And again, as a pastor, someone says, well, I'm seeking. Good. You know what? I have a good word for you. That my master says if you seek, you'll find. And so I'm going to help you strengthen your seeking. And so often, so we just got off the bus, and Vendonk walks the other way, and Job says, "Oh, there he goes. He's walking the other way again." He keeps doing that.
I didn't say that.
And he comes back, and he's got a picture, not very well taken, of course, because the cell phone and John, not so good. But he's got this picture of this clam shell hanging from a building. And, well, what's this about? And he's like, this is the Camino. If you want, you can start the Camino from here. And
Camino de Santiago.
Camino de Santiago.
Pilgrimage to Spain.
Talk about the riches of pilgrimage and this. And you're just awash in it here in Europe. And I would have walked by that thing and, well, there's some random thing hanging on some random building. It's all beautiful and shocking here, and because it's ancient and mysterious to me, but he had eyes to see that, oh, wow, the Camino can start here. And so often it's that conjunction of I like Vervaeke's language, the moreness and the suchness. I mean, it has to be such in that, well, there's this weird metal shell on the side of a random building. But once you understand the suchness of that shell, puts you into the moreness of going into the mystery. The mystery can't be grasped. It can be approached. All of that.
Sorry, I have another. We keep running into mystery. An important question that tends to be asked of new people on the Discord is, how did you get to this place? Now, what we hear 9 out of 10 times is, I found Peterson, then I found Venneclay, or I found Peterson, Peugeot, Venneclay, or Peterson, Vervaeke, Venneclay. Usually Peterson is the first point. But then you say, well, how did you find Peterson? The algorithm, which is nobody knows how this works. It's basically magic as far as, what's the quote by Arthur C. Clarke? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. It's like, we don't know. Peterson was presented to us. We looked and saw, and like, oh, now I need to talk to people. And, oh, well, here's this other guy. And now I found, I'm going to repeat myself. But yeah, I keep seeing mystery in this conversation in that sense. Not sure why I felt the need to say that. So,
That's right.
Was your question answered?
I think so. Well, I'd just like to say, wasn't the church always a place to collect all the beauty in the world? So why wouldn't you keep doing that?
Yeah, you're making a medieval point there.
The
when
church is the
when
place
the
that
church
collects the beauty.
was still the expression of the community's yearning for beauty. I think it's a beautiful, and I think we've lost it somehow. And maybe we have to, especially here in Europe, we've got beautiful churches, and we may have to let go of them in order for them to function as estuaries.
Right.
So they're very expensive. That's one thing. So the dwindling communities may have an economic reason to say, I'll let go of this beautiful church, but I do claim my place in that community building again. I would love to see our larger churches in the European cities to become vibrant places where people from all persuasions come, because the church now was the expression of the community. Well, anyway.
The ancestors, not just the religion, right?
So I had one appearance on Justin Brierley's Unbelievable, and never knew who he paired me with this guy who was trying to do secular church. And it was a fascinating conversation. I think it was from the UK, because he said, I should be booming right now because, all this secularity, but my groups are dying. And I just noticed that it is very much the mystery, but you have to be, in a sense, you have to be gripped by the mystery. You can't grip it, it has to grip you. And so you see churches, churches are all over the place. Well, we're here about beauty. Well, it's got to have some more suchness to it. It's got to be a beauty. It's got to go in a direction. So is that the ending movie? The ending music to the
the herring call.
It's the herring call, that's right.
the herring call.
Right.
No, that's true. And again, all of that is mysterious. Why this group? Why this place? Why is this beautiful?
And why do the Vikings have to come and take it away?
Only to they themselves come around and become Christians themselves. What a crazy thing.
So are there more questions in the audience?
Let's say you're a young guy, you found Peterson, you're very self-conscious, shy, you have a thirst for knowledge, but you're afraid of being known by other people. What would you say to them if they contemplate going to an estuary? But they're maybe, not...
You'll find a lot of other people like that. and so again, for me too, part of Estuary is, I online I found a lot of people who, they're introverts, usually pretty smart. They need to get out of the basement. And they need to get in a room with some other people. And they need to... Oh yeah, we're in the basement. We've gone down to the underworld.
The catacombs.
And meet some friends. And, for a lot of these guys and others in our local group have talked about this. Peterson's been talking about it lately too. In terms of become the kind of person... let's say you're a man and you'd really love to find a woman and settle down, have a wife and a family. Become the kind of person that a woman would value. And maybe you're introverted and maybe you've got some nerdy things, but I think nerds make great husbands. They're loyal. They make a lot better husbands. I'd much rather have my daughters come home with a nerd than a lot of a player. So. No, I think, especially in this group, you will find many more people like yourself, and you'll make friends. And the process of being together and practicing will continue to help build you, probably more into who you want to be. You got a point in there?
Well, I guess that goes for friends too, right? Just be the friend you would like to have or would like to be.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly.
And I would say one mistake that I made with friends, that I would start off with theory. I'd be like, I learned this new thing. And indeed, I want to proclaim something. I want to tell them something. And I've noticed actually far more often, they're just interested in how I'm doing, how I'm feeling. And then they might be drawn in because they're like, okay, where does it come from? And that actually you don't need to bring up Peterson in that regard at all. It can just be about, how are you feeling currently? And then, at least that's, for example, how it worked out with me and my girlfriend at the time. Is like, now, we couldn't talk about these things because she was like, I'm not interested in them. But she was like, but what's going on in your life? Like, why are you talking about the evolutionary biological dynamics between men and women when we're just you and I? And that's like, okay, yeah, you're right. Like, we should talk about that. So that's one thing I can say, don't start off with the heady stuff. You'll get there later. But if you start off there, then people are like, okay, it's just weird, That's the Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic weirdness that I'm talking about.
Yeah, but then that's just the first question. What brings you here?
Yeah.
And that usually starts everything off.
Yeah.
What did you mean by not wanting to be known?
I think a lot of young people have shame, disappointment. They don't feel like they're at where they should be. They feel behind, or like they're not doing all that they could do, be all that they could be. And so if you go on a Discord, that's already a hump because you can speak and you have your voice judged. But if you go somewhere, your entire body, your being can get judged by other people.
Yeah.
Or even your intentions. Like other people may laugh at you that you apparently have a need for these kinds of questions.
And this
So
has
people
been
have shame.
intensified, hasn't it? It's been
I think
after
so.
a few
Yeah.
years that we had these lockdowns. I mean,
There's a lot of social anxiety, yes.
yes.
So to get over that hump and go to an estuary, I think there are lots of people who would want to, but who are afraid. So what would you say to them?
And they may also be a bit awkward at it.
Yeah, and they can be very intense once they open up.
And not to make a joke here, but that's why we need the protocol.
Thank you.
No, but it is a way of, because why don't you want to be known? Because you're afraid to be judged. In the end, I mean, if you, in the end, you may judge yourself already. So that would only be enforced if other people would mirror that, and then you go off from that meeting feeling even more miserable than you came into it. Of course, I understand that, but one of the reasons why you're so often judged is because you're not comfortable. You're a bit awkward in the situation, and that's when you're extra sensitive. And that's why it's so lovely when these groups have something of a order, of a protocol that says, okay, very simple rules. Nobody knows them, by the way, now. So this is how it goes, and and then you can fit in. And I think actually something of a slightly more ordered group for these people is so much better than just going out in the cafe and try to be there your lovely self.
And to that end, I would also suggest, even if you don't necessarily see yourself as being an estuary host or an estuary leader, don't be shy about signing up on ELSNet to participate in the leader training, because it'll give you some idea of how the protocol works and how that actually translates into a place where you can find yourself and hear yourself think, and find some way to express yourself in a meaningful way. And then if you bump into something, you become familiar with the protocol, and you bump into somebody that you can share that with and say, hey, you're a little bit more of an extrovert than I am. Can I tell you about how this works? Or maybe you want to join the ELSNet training program for a little while. And then together we can start a group. That seems like a meaningful sequence of events that could lead to the formation of a group in your town.
Yeah, I would also just like to add in there for people who are nervous to join that most people are good people. And sometimes you just need to hear that they're not out there to judge you. And there's this expression in Dutch, and you will have to help me translate it. Zo de waard is vertrouwt hij zijn gasten.
Oh, like
and,
the hostess, he expects his guests to behave?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. And then I think that also works the other way around. So if you're the way you look at other people, I guess I'm usually not as judgmental about other people as I think other people are about me. So that's a good thing to realize, that if you show up there, people are probably not that interested in you to judge you. So just putting it on the table.
And that's actually a great statement.
Yeah, and then also secondly, if you do feel that uncomfortable with yourself, it's only putting off the inevitable, because you will have to go to school or to work or I don't know, somewhere else to meet people, and then you'd better practice in a safe place, which is an estuary, before you get out into, let's say, the real world, because it's gonna happen anyway. So, just my 2 cents.
What's that question?
In places like a bar, you have people who don't have an implicit understanding of why they're there, or an implicit agreement why they're there. And so what you inevitably kind of get is that people start forming cliques who have their own culture and then seem to become the dominant culture. And that becomes adversarial. So if you have an implicit understanding of why you're there, and invite everybody to come there, then you will be one culture, and you can grow that culture gradually, and you won't have that cliquishness, the fighting against each other for dominance, and that's something I think you seek to prevent, exactly by creating an estuary with a foundation of friendship.
Yes, thank you.
And I think that culture question has been central. We don't talk about it much, but partly because culture is too complex to reduce down to a few things. But part of the gift we have from say video, unlike let's say plain text, is that by watching myself, by watching John, by watching us as a group, you begin to see, okay, there's a leader in this group, and sometimes in a group some people don't behave, but the job of the leader is to, reinforce the culture. This is how we talk to each other. We're listening here, and the leader might take someone aside and say, this is the protocol, this is what we're doing. If you really want to convince all of us of this great new insight that you've had, you can start a YouTube channel maybe and see how many people want to watch. You're welcome to do that. but this is what we're doing here.
Was that why we have all these new YouTube channels going on right now?
Not going to say.
This advice has been given before.
Anyone else? No?
All right.
Good time to land the plane.
Yeah. Well,
Oh, go ahead, John.
Oh, yeah.
No. I'm
One
just
love.
landing the plane.
One love.
We honor Freddie.
Yeah. Love you, Freddie, if you ever see this.
Well, thank you.
thank you everyone for being here, for partaking in the discussion, and also thank you to the audience for your great questions and for being here.